It all started with something so small, adjusting my hair in the garage, and within seconds, I was in over my head. That single moment should have been innocent, mundane even, but instead, it opened a door I should have kept firmly locked. Let me introduce myself. My name is Rachel. I'm 45 years old, and on the surface, I have a picture-perfect life. I'm married to Mark, a successful businessman who works long hours, always chasing the next deal. Our home is spacious, our bills are paid, and from the outside looking in, you'd think I had it all. But the truth is, my marriage has been running on autopilot for years. Mark and I married 8 years ago, and when I said I do, I inherited more than a husband. I also gained a stepson, Dylan. Dylan was only 15 at the time, quiet and awkward, like most teenagers. I'll admit, I wasn't sure how to step into the role of a stepmother, so I kept my distance. Over the years, he grew up, went to college, and eventually moved back in with us to save money while starting his first job. Now, at 23, Dylan is no longer the shy boy I remember. He's tall, confident, and has a presence that's impossible to ignore. It was a Saturday afternoon when everything changed. Mark was out of town on yet another business trip, leaving me to manage the house. I had spent the morning organizing the garage, a task I had been putting off for weeks. Dylan had offered to help, though his version of helping was mostly leaning against the workbench and scrolling through his phone. I didn't mind. I was used to doing things on my own. Sweat clung to my skin as I stacked boxes and swept up years of accumulated dust. My hair kept falling into my face, so I reached up to tie it back into a loose bun. That's when it happened. The thin strap of my tank top slipped off my shoulder, completely exposing the curve of my collarbone. It wasn't intentional. I wasn't trying to do anything suggestive. But when I glanced up, I saw Dylan watching me, his phone forgotten in his hand. His eyes lingered a moment too long, and I felt a strange heat crawl up my neck. Here. Let me help with that box," he said, breaking the tension as he quickly stepped forward. I nodded, my voice caught in my throat, and let him lift the heavy container I'd been struggling with. But even as we worked side by side, I couldn't shake the look he had given me. It was like something had shifted in the air between us. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I had imagined it. But as the afternoon went on, I caught him glancing at me again. And again. Each time, the room felt a little smaller, the silence a little heavier. By the time we finished organizing, my pulse was racing for reasons I didn't want to admit. I brushed it off as fatigue, but deep down, I knew better. Something had changed that day in the garage. I didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning of a line I had no business crossing. That evening, after Dylan and I had finished organizing the garage, I thought I'd be able to put the strange tension behind me. I told myself I was overthinking everything, that Dylan's glances had been meaningless. But as I sat alone in the living room, a glass of wine in hand, I replayed the entire day in my head. It wasn't just the look he gave me when my strap fell, it was the way he moved after that. Subtle things, like standing a little closer than usual or brushing past me as he carried a box, his arm grazing mine. Even now, hours later, I could still feel the warmth of those fleeting touches. I tried to shake it off. It was ridiculous, really. He was my stepson. I shouldn't be entertaining these thoughts. But the truth was, it wasn't just him. It was me. The way my body reacted, the way my heart raced under his gaze, I couldn't ignore it. The next morning, I avoided him. I busied myself in the kitchen, hoping he'd sleep in like he usually did. But around mid-morning he walked in, still shirtless from just waking up. His hair was messy, and he looked every bit like the young man he was, strong, confident, and completely unaware of the effect he had on me. "Morning," he said casually, grabbing a cup of coffee. "Morning," I replied, keeping my eyes firmly on the cutting board in front of me. I was chopping vegetables for a salad, but my hands trembled slightly. He leaned against the counter, sipping his coffee. "You okay? You've been kind of quiet since yesterday." I froze for a moment, then forced a laugh. "Just tired." "That garage was a mess," he chuckled, the sound low and easy. "Yeah, but it was worth it. You're pretty strong for someone your size, you know." I glanced at him, surprised by the compliment. His eyes met mine, and for a split second I saw it again, that same look from yesterday. The tension was back, heavy and undeniable. I turned away quickly, pretending to focus on the vegetables. Well, someone had to do it, I said lightly. For the next few days, I avoided being alone with him as much as possible. But it didn't matter. He was always around, always watching me with those eyes that seemed to see right through me. I tried to act normal, to be the stepmother I was supposed to be. But every time he walked into the room, my resolve crumbled just a little more. Then it happened again. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and Mark was still out of town. I had just come home from a morning yoga class, still in my leggings and tank top. The garage door was open, and Dylan was working on his car, a sleek black Mustang he'd been restoring for months. "Need any help?" I called out, forcing a casual tone. He looked up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Sure, if you don't mind holding this for a second." I stepped into the garage, and he handed me a wrench, guiding my hand to a bolt on the engine. His fingers brushed mine, and I felt a jolt of electricity. "Just keep it steady," he said, his voice low. I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. The garage was warm, the summer heat seeping in through the open door. But it wasn't just the temperature making my skin prickle. I could feel him behind me, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of motor oil and sweat. "Rachel," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. I turned to look at him, and the moment our eyes met, I knew there was no going back. He reached out, his hand brushing against my arm, and my breath caught in my throat. "You felt it too, didn't you? Yesterday," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I should have walked away. I should have told him this was wrong, that it couldn't happen. But instead, I stood there, frozen, as he stepped closer. "Dylan," I began, but he silenced me with a look. The next thing I knew, his lips were on mine, and every rational thought I had disappeared. His kiss was firm and insistent, his hands gripping my waist as if he was afraid I'd pull away. But I didn't. For the first time in years, I felt alive, desired, wanted, consumed by something bigger than myself. When we finally broke apart, I was breathless, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. We can't," I said, my voice shaky. He nodded, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't about to stop. And deep down, I knew I wouldn't either. I thought that kiss in the garage would be the end of it. A one-time mistake, born out of loneliness and a moment of weakness. But as the days passed, it became clear that it was just the beginning. I avoided Dylan as much as I could, but it was impossible to completely ignore him. We lived under the same roof, after all. Every encounter, no matter how brief, was charged with an undercurrent of tension. I could feel his eyes on me, watching, waiting for the next opportunity. And worse, I could feel myself wanting it. One night, about a week after the incident in the garage, I was sitting in the living room, flipping through channels on the TV. Mark was still out of town, another business trip that had stretched into its second week. I was wearing a thin camisole and pajama shorts, comfortable but modest enough for lounging at home. Dylan walked in, shirtless, with a faint sheen of sweat on his chest from what I assumed was a workout in the home gym. He grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge and leaned against the counter, his eyes scanning me with a confidence that made my stomach flutter. "You're up late," he said, his voice casual, but his tone laced with something heavier. I shrugged, keeping my eyes on the TV. Couldn't sleep. He walked over and sat on the opposite end of the couch. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. I could smell the faint scent of his cologne mixed with sweat, and it was intoxicating in a way I hated myself for noticing. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the low hum of the TV. I could feel his presence beside me, close enough that our knees were almost touching. I tried to focus on the screen, but my mind was elsewhere. "Rachel," he said, his voice soft, breaking the quiet. I looked at him, and the intensity in his eyes made my breath hitch. "This thing between us." He trailed off, his gaze locked on mine. "You feel it too, don't you?" I opened my mouth to deny it, to shut him down before things went any further, but the words wouldn't come, because the truth was, I did feel it. Every time he looked at me, every time he was near, my body betrayed me. "Dylan, we can't," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "It's wrong." He moved closer, his hand brushing against mine. "If it's so wrong, why does it feel like this?" I couldn't answer him. I couldn't think. All I knew was that his hand was warm against mine, his touch sending sparks through my skin. Before I could stop myself, I leaned in, my lips finding his. It was softer this time, slower, but no less intense. His hand slid to my waist, pulling me closer, and I melted into him, my resolve crumbling completely. The kiss deepened, and I found myself straddling him, my fingers tangling in his hair. My heart was pounding, my skin burning with a heat I hadn't felt in years. His hands roamed my back, my sides, his touch igniting every nerve in my body. We didn't stop until a noise from outside startled us, a car door slamming somewhere down the street. I pulled away, my chest heaving, reality crashing down around me. "We can't," I said again, more to myself than to him. "This can't happen." But the look in his eyes told me he wasn't about to let this go. And deep down I knew I wouldn't either. The next few days were a blur of stolen glances and whispered conversations. Every time we were alone, the tension was palpable. We found excuses to brush against each other, to touch in ways that could almost be explained away. It wasn't long before it happened again. I was in the kitchen, making a late-night snack. The house was quiet, Mark still away, and I was lost in thought when I felt him behind me. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low and smooth. I turned to face him, my heart racing. He was standing close, too close, and the look in his eyes made my knees weak. "Neither could I," he added, his gaze dropping to my lips. I knew what was about to happen, and I knew I should stop it, but I didn't. I couldn't. He closed the distance between us, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that was both gentle and demanding. My hands found their way to his chest, his skin warm under my touch. He lifted me onto the counter, his body pressing against mine, and I forgot everything. Who we were, what this meant, what it could cost us. When it was over, we were both breathless, staring at each other in the dim light of the kitchen. I wanted to say something, to explain or apologize, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just nodded, sliding off the counter and leaving the room without another word. After that night, there was no denying what was happening between us. We didn't talk about it, didn't try to define it. We just let it happen, over and over, in quiet moments when we were alone. It was in the living room one afternoon, the blinds drawn and the house empty. It was in my office late at night, the door locked and the glow of my computer screen, the only light. It was in the pool one warm evening, the water lapping around us as we lost ourselves in each other. Every time, the risk made it more exhilarating. The thought of being caught, of Mark walking in, only heightened the intensity. But with each stolen moment, the guilt grew heavier. I told myself I'd end it, that I'd find a way to stop. But every time I saw him, every time he looked at me with that hunger in his eyes, I gave in. I was spiraling, and I didn't know how to stop. It wasn't just the physical side of what was happening between Dylan and me that consumed my thoughts. It was the emotional chaos that followed each stolen moment. Every time it happened, I told myself it would be the last. I would wake up the next morning determined to rebuild the boundaries I had shattered. But then I'd see him again. Whether it was over breakfast, sitting across the kitchen table, or walking past me in the hallway, and all those promises to myself would dissolve. I spent most nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, with guilt clawing at my chest. Mark's side of the bed remained cold and empty, a constant reminder of the distance in our marriage. Yet even when he was home, we were more like polite roommates than husband and wife. His long hours at work and his constant preoccupation with business deals had turned our relationship into a formality. There were no lingering touches, no intimate moments, only surface-level conversations and the occasional perfunctory kiss. I told myself that Mark's neglect was part of the reason I had allowed things with Dylan to go so far. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the whole truth. The real reason was simpler, and far more selfish. Dylan made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. One evening, as I sat alone in my home office, staring at the draft of an event proposal I was supposed to finish, I found myself thinking about Dylan again. My mind drifted back to the night in the kitchen, the heat of his body against mine, the way his hands had gripped my waist like I was something he couldn't bear to let go of. I slammed my laptop shut, frustrated with myself. This wasn't me. I wasn't the kind of woman who cheated on her husband, let alone with her stepson. But no matter how hard I tried to fight it, I couldn't stop wanting him. The sound of footsteps in the hallway pulled me from my thoughts. I looked up to see Dylan standing in the doorway, his hand resting casually on the frame. Working late? he asked, his tone light but his eyes intense. I nodded, trying to ignore the way my pulse quickened at the sight of him. Just finishing up a proposal. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. My heart raced as he walked over to my desk, leaning against the edge. You've been avoiding me, he said, his voice low. I haven't. You have, he interrupted, his gaze locking onto mine. Why? I couldn't answer him. How could I explain the storm of emotions swirling inside me? The guilt, the fear, the desire, it was too much. Dylan, we can't keep doing this, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Why not? He asked, his tone soft but insistent. Do you regret it? The question caught me off guard. Did I regret it? I knew I should. Every part of me knew how wrong this was. But when I thought about the way he made me feel, how alive, how wanted, I couldn't bring myself to say yes. Instead, I looked away, my silence answering his question. He leaned closer, his hand brushing against mine where it rested on the desk. Then why fight it? After he left, I sat there for what felt like hours, torn between the life I had built and the one I was dangerously close to destroying. Mark wasn't a bad man. He was a good provider, a stable partner. But he wasn't passionate. Not anymore. And I wasn't sure if I could go back to the quiet, predictable routine of our marriage after tasting something so wild, so intoxicating. The next morning, as Mark returned from his trip, I tried to push my thoughts of Dylan to the back of my mind. I forced a smile as he kissed my cheek, his touch perfunctory and distant. How was the conference? I asked, pouring him a cup of coffee. Exhausting, he replied, sitting at the kitchen table and scrolling through his phone. But productive. We landed the deal with that European firm. That's great, I said, my voice flat. Dylan walked into the room then, his hair damp from a shower, and my stomach twisted. He glanced at me briefly, his expression unreadable, before grabbing a piece of toast and sitting down across from his father. The three of us sat there in silence, the air heavy with unspoken tension. Mark was oblivious, buried in his emails, but I couldn't bring myself to look at Dylan. Over the next few days, I tried to distance myself from Dylan, throwing myself into work and avoiding him whenever I could. But it didn't matter how much space I tried to put between us. The connection was still there, simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reignite. And it did, in the most unexpected way. It was late one evening, and Mark had gone to bed early, complaining of a headache. I was sitting in the living room, nursing a glass of wine, when Dylan walked in. He didn't say anything, just sat down on the couch beside me. For a while, we just sat there in silence, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. But then he reached out, his fingers brushing against mine where they rested on the arm of the couch. I didn't pull away. Rachel, he said softly, his voice breaking the quiet. I turned to look at him, and the vulnerability in his eyes made my chest tighten. I know this is complicated, he said. I know it's wrong, but I can't stop thinking about you. My throat tightened and I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. You don't know what you're saying, I whispered. I do. He insisted, his hand closing over mine. And I think you feel the same way. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I leaned into him, my head resting against his shoulder. For a moment, we just sat there, the weight of our emotions hanging heavy in the air. I don't know how to stop this, I admitted finally, my voice barely audible. He didn't answer, but his hand tightened around mine, a silent acknowledgement that neither did he. I knew I was playing with fire. Every moment I spent with Dylan was another step closer to a line I couldn't uncross. But no matter how hard I tried to resist, I couldn't let go. I told myself it was temporary, that it would fade with time. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was in too deep, and there was no turning back. It was bound to happen sooner or later. The longer Dylan and I let this go on, the higher the stakes became, and the more careless we got. Still, I convinced myself we were careful enough. Timing our stolen moments, whispering when we were alone, always listening for the sound of Mark's car pulling into the driveway. But sometimes, the thrill of it made us reckless. It was a Friday afternoon, and the house was unusually quiet. Mark had left that morning for another meeting in the city, and I knew he wouldn't be back until late. Dylan was in the backyard, tinkering with something on the patio. I had told myself to stay busy, to focus on work, but as the hours dragged on, my resolve weakened. I found him sitting on the edge of the pool, his legs dangling in the water. He wasn't wearing a shirt, just a pair of athletic shorts, his tanned skin glistening under the afternoon sun. "Getting some sun?" I asked, trying to sound casual as I walked over to him. He looked up at me, a lazy smile spreading across his face. "Something like that? Want to join me?" I hesitated, glancing over my shoulder toward the house, even though I knew no one was home. Then, before I could talk myself out of it, I sat down beside him, slipping off my sandals and dipping my feet into the water. We sat there for a while, not saying much, just enjoying the quiet. But the tension between us was palpable, like a magnet pulling us closer. "I missed this," he said suddenly, his voice low. I turned to look at him, my brow furrowing. "Missed what?" "This," he said, gesturing between us. "Being with you. Just being close to you." His words hit me harder than I expected. I wasn't sure what to say, so I didn't say anything. Instead, I reached out, my hand brushing against his. That was all it took. In an instant, he was pulling me closer, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that set my heart racing. I didn't resist. I couldn't. His hand slid around my waist, pulling me onto his lap, and I felt the cool water splashing against my legs as we lost ourselves in each other. It wasn't until I heard the unmistakable sound of a car pulling into the driveway that reality came crashing down. "Mark!" I gasped, scrambling to pull away from Dylan. He froze for a moment, his eyes wide with panic, before quickly helping me to my feet. We both ran inside, dripping wet, and I could hear Mark's footsteps on the gravel as he approached the front door. I darted into the laundry room, grabbing a towel and wrapping it around myself just as the door opened. Dylan followed me in, his face still flushed, but he quickly grabbed a t-shirt off the counter and slipped it on. "Hey, I'm home," Mark called from the foyer. "Hi, honey," I replied, forcing my voice to sound calm as I stepped into the hallway. "You're back early." "Yeah, the meeting finished sooner than expected," he said, setting his briefcase down. His eyes scanned me briefly, lingering on the damp towel wrapped around me. "You were swimming?" "Just cooling off," I said with a shrug, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. He nodded, seemingly satisfied with my answer, and turned to Dylan, who had appeared behind me. "And you? Looks like you got some sun." "Yeah," Dylan said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "I was just out by the pool." Mark didn't seem to notice anything out of the ordinary. He walked into the kitchen, opening the fridge and pulling out a beer. I exchanged a quick glance with Dylan, and for a moment, I thought we were in the clear. But then Mark turned back to me, his brow furrowing slightly. "You okay? You seem a little off." "I'm fine," I said quickly, giving him a tight smile. "Just tired, I guess." He didn't press further, but I could feel his eyes on me as I walked past him into the living room. My hands were shaking as I sat down on the couch, my mind racing. That was too close. Far too close. Later that night, after Mark had gone to bed, I found Dylan in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a glass of water in his hand. "That was risky," he said, his voice low. "I know," I replied. My arms crossed over my chest. "It can't happen again. Not like that." He nodded, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't ready to let go. And neither was I. After that close call with Mark, I thought I'd finally wake up and face reality. The risk of being discovered was too high, and yet, even that wasn't enough to stop me. The guilt gnawed at me constantly, but so did the desire. It was as though the boundaries I once believed were immovable had dissolved completely. The person I used to be, the faithful wife, the responsible stepmother, felt like a distant memory. One afternoon, a few days after the incident by the pool, I found myself alone in my office. I had an event proposal open on my laptop, but my focus wasn't on work. My thoughts kept drifting to Dylan, his hands on me, the way his lips felt against mine. The memories replayed in my mind like a loop I couldn't escape. And then, as if summoned by my thoughts, there was a soft knock at the door. "Come in," I said, my voice steady despite the way my pulse quickened. The door creaked open, and Dylan stepped inside, his expression unreadable. He closed the door behind him, leaning against it for a moment before walking over to me. "You've been avoiding me again," he said, his tone calm but firm. "I'm not." I started, but he cut me off. "You are, and I get it. I know this is complicated," he said, sitting down on the edge of my desk. "But you can't pretend it didn't happen." I sighed, leaning back in my chair. I'm not pretending, Dylan. I know what we did. I think about it all the time. Then why keep running from it? He asked, his eyes locking onto mine. We're adults. We both know what this is. What this is wrong, I said, my voice trembling. You're my stepson. Do you know what would happen if Mark found out? If anyone found out? He didn't respond right away, and for a moment the silence hung heavy between us. Then finally he spoke. I don't care about any of that, he said softly. I care about you. His words caught me off guard, and I felt my chest tighten. Dylan. You don't have to say it back, he added quickly, his voice barely above a whisper. I just needed you to know. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to push him away, to tell him this had to end. But another part of me, the part I was increasingly losing control over, wanted to pull him closer and never let go. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, as Mark slept soundly beside me. His breathing was slow and even, and I couldn't help but compare it to the way Dylan's breath had felt against my skin. The thought made my stomach churn with guilt, but it also sent a wave of heat through me that I couldn't ignore. I got up, careful not to wake Mark, and went downstairs. The house was dark and quiet, but I didn't turn on any lights. I didn't need to. My feet seemed to know where they were going, as if guided by something outside of my control. Dylan was in the living room, sitting on the couch with a book in his hands. He looked up when he saw me, his eyes widening slightly in surprise. Couldn't sleep? He asked, setting the book down. I shook my head, my heart pounding in my chest. Neither could I. I walked over to him, my steps slow and deliberate. When I reached the couch, I sat down beside him, my hands trembling in my lap. Dylan, I began, my voice barely above a whisper. Whatever this is, it can't keep happening. He didn't respond right away, and for a moment I thought he was going to agree. But then he reached out, his hand covering mine, and the look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. You don't really want it to stop, he said softly. I didn't answer, because he was right. The next morning, I woke up feeling more conflicted than ever. Mark was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop and a cup of coffee. He looked up when I walked in, giving me a small smile. Morning, he said. Morning, I replied, pouring myself a cup of coffee and sitting down across from him. For a moment we sat there in silence, the only sound the clicking of his keyboard. Then he looked up at me, his brow furrowing slightly. You've been quiet lately, he said. Is everything okay? I forced a smile, nodding quickly. I'm fine. Just a lot on my mind. He didn't press further, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't entirely convinced. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself slipping further and further into the relationship with Dylan. It wasn't just the physical aspect anymore, although that was a part of it. It was the way he made me feel, the way he looked at me, as if I were the only thing that mattered. The way he listened to me, the way he touched me. With Mark, I felt invisible. With Dylan, I felt alive. But the guilt never went away. Every time Mark kissed me goodbye before leaving for work, every time he asked me how my day was, I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of my own betrayal. I knew I couldn't keep living like this. Something had to give. One evening, as I sat alone in my office, I opened a blank document on my laptop. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before I began to type. It started with something so small, adjusting my hair in the garage, and within seconds, everything spiraled out of control. I didn't know why I was writing it. Maybe I thought putting it into words would help me make sense of it all, or maybe I just needed to confess, even if only to myself. But as I wrote, I realized something. This wasn't just a story about guilt or desire. It was a story about me, about a woman who had spent years feeling invisible and had finally found a way to feel alive again, even if it meant crossing lines she could never uncross. When I finished, I closed the laptop, my hands trembling. I didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid to find out.